Really important this week, a question that if you Google questions Jesus asks, this is usually number one on the list. So let's set the stage, get us to Matthew 16, remind us where we've been, and then we'll hop right into it. So Matthew 16, 13 through 28 today, if you want to open up your Bibles. Here's what's happened before it. Let's get oriented to this passage in the text. So Jesus had an argument with the Pharisees that demanded a sign. We kind of talked about that last week with Mark. They said, we need a sign. And then he warns the disciples in the boat, right? Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. This is about this conversation. So they leave, and that's where Jesus warns them in the boat. We read it out of Mark, but it's a pericope in Matthew as well. The disciples get worried because they forget to bring bread because they're disciples and they can't figure things out. And then Jesus gives them a verbal facepalm, right? And that yeast was a metaphor and that he could feed thousands by a miracle. This gets us to today. There's a person who I had the privilege of in my last doctoral class of having come in as a professor for a couple of the lectures. His name is Frederick Buechner. Everyone say Frederick Buechner. It doesn't look like Buechner, though, so if I say Buechner, it's because it's spelled differently. But really amazing pastor, wrote a book, one of my favorite books about preaching. It's The Gospel as Tragedy, Fairy Tale, and Comedy. So how you can read one pericope, one story, and kind of see it in a different lens to understand it a little differently. So he talked to us in class, and he had a story that he told. So I'm going to kind of tell the story that he told us to orient us to this text here today. But he grew up in the very elite of sophisticated East Coast upbringing. So he rubs elbows with famous people that fancy themselves as real modern day folks that are too good to engage in really anything spiritual in any capacity. So he says when he was a young person, he was at a dinner party, like at a very fancy person's house, and he told them he was going to go to seminary to learn to be a pastor. And the hostess for the evening looked at him with this gaze and said, "A pastor? Really? Tell me, Frederick, was this your own idea or did someone advise you poorly?" Years later, he's teaching a semester at Wheaton College, and sitting at lunch, he heard students asking each other what God was doing in their life lately. And he said, if you asked that question in New York City, where he grew up, buildings would crumble, grown men would faint dead away. And his point was, many times where you ask a question will determine how the question is received. Does that make sense? That question, what's God doing in your life? If I was sitting with Ashley when we were dating at Taylor and we were sitting in Baldwin's dining hall, that is a very normal conversation. If I was sitting outside of Human Biology 101 in Bloomington, that's not the conversation most people are having. It's a different sense of how the question is. Where you ask a question kind of reads how you can hear it. Are we good there? I just left Frederick's little story there. So the first part of Matthew 16, 13 through 20 is probably a fairly familiar pair of questions. So let's jump right to it. Matthew 16, starting at 13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his... Hang on. Sorry. Wait, is the opening of that not important? We know right what the question is, right? Who do people say the Son of Man is? But that's not how the verse starts, is it? Let's hear how it starts again. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples a question. You can't just skip right to the questions, because where you ask a question, it helps you understand it a little bit more fully. That's kind of the core of this here. So you can't just skip the geographical marker for this incident, because if you do, you're going to miss a really key piece of information that ends up informing how this important exchange between Jesus and these disciples and Peter, it plays out. So where are they when the story opens? They came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarville. I wrote in my notes, Viva Caesarea, right? A little Viva Las Vegas action. Well, once upon a time, it was the region known as Naphtali. It was one of the areas for one of the tribes of Naphtali. It was an Israelite place, a Hebrew place, a God place, part of the Promised Land. But think about this: when the Soviet communists, they couldn't stand to have a town in their region called St. Petersburg, so they changed the name of that town to Leningrad. Look, I knew you'd know it. So the Romans changed names to suit themselves better, not to have a place called Naphtali inside the Roman kingdom. So they name it Caesarea Philippi, which in the Greek is literally Caesarea of Philip. So It's spelled wrong, so it's one L there. It's distinguished from an older city of Caesarea, which was south and west along the Mediterranean Sea. But it pointed to this immediate history of these people in this place. About 20 BC, Caesar Augustus had given this town and its surrounding region to King Herod. And he builds up this city, including a temple made of white marble that honored the cult of Caesar. It was a big temple to Augustus Caesar. And when he died, the region passed to King Philip, who further built up the place and renamed it after himself. It's not just Caesarville, it's now Philip's Caesarville. And so to flatter his own honor, his own position, his own honor, and his patron, Caesar Augustus, they renamed the town. In other words, this is a place that held up the status quo of politics as usual, right? This is a place that worshipped Augustus. It was filled with political patronage and reveling in all the worldly things the Roman Empire could offer. The name of the town itself, right? This is Philip's Caesarville. It points to, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back a little bit. I'll call it Caesar. You give it to me, I'll call it Philip's Caesarville. We'll take care of each other. It's a give and take, right? So translated into the 21st century context, this is a place that would be crawling with high-paid lobbyists, wearing $1,000 suits, earning $700 an hour to peddle to some high-octane single-interest group how to manipulate things to work in their favor. This is what's taking on in this place. Very political center. This is where all the highfalutins are. You with me? Good. Don't skip verse 13a. It informs how to read these questions. Very important. So this particular question, in the shadow of the power politics of Rome and everything that goes along with it, changes this question from this idle question of curiosity into a super loaded question full of implications. It'd be one thing for Jesus to ask this question sitting by the seaside in Galilee, surrounded by Jewish people. It's quite another to ask it in the middle of Caesarville. Think about it, even today, a question that sounds perfectly normal to talk about in Taylor's dining hall would sound very different if I asked that question standing at the podium in the Senate. You with me? So Jesus' famous question here is loaded with background. And so to ask it in the middle of Viva la Caesarville heightens the drama of this question. So now, we're pretty familiar with these questions, 16, 13 through 20. I think we've always misread them, though. Even when I was working on the sermon, I was like, I know the questions. And I started going. And then I read it, and I was like, maybe I don't know the questions as much as I thought. But this is how we think it goes. Question 1. Jesus first asked the disciples, who do people say I am? Okay? So this is our memory verse of it. And the answer, you're some prophet who's maybe back from the dead. The second question, Jesus asks the disciples, who do you think I am? And they say, the Messiah. And the message, obviously, right, the crowd doesn't know who Jesus is, but Peter, the disciples, they got this one right. But there's something going on here, because let's actually read it and see what questions are being asked. So 16:13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Who do people say the Son of Man is? So we have a kind of right. He's asking the disciples this general, what is the public thinking sort of thing. But there's something else in that second part. See, we think it's who do people say I am? But that's not what he asks, is it? What does he say? Who do people say the Son of Man is? Ooh, this is a term that Jesus had been borrowing from the prophetic and apocalyptic texts, right? In over a dozen Old Testament contexts, right? The Son of Man is this mysterious, symbolic, thing that you can read about. It's part of this very complicated picture of God bringing salvation to Israel and to the world. It's very strange if you read it in the Old Testament. And Jesus, he'll refer to himself as the Son of Man, or he'll refer to the Son of Man about 30 times in just the Gospel of Matthew. And we read those, and we go, he's talking about himself. We know this. He's talking about himself. But if you look at those 30 references and try to imagine people at the time, no 2,000 years of biblical whatever, where we've been told Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, and that's who he's claiming to be. Put yourself in the time frame. It's an Old Testament prophecy. He keeps talking about the Son of Man thing, and it's not as clear what it is that he's saying. It's not as clear that he's talking specifically about himself to those hearing it in that time. Sometimes it seems like he's referring back to the Old Testament apocalyptic and prophetic texts, saying something like, how this might be someday fulfilled. And other times it can seem like he's talking to himself, but in the context, they might not put that together right away. Are you with me? It's clear to us, not so clear to the hearers at the time. So with that ambiguity of them in mind, Matthew 16 sounds more like Jesus is fishing for a question like this. Who do people say the Son of Man is? The strange figure in the prophets. Are people talking about that apocalyptic figures at all around here? This is kind of what he's getting at. Who do people say this ambiguous, thing is? And here's their wrong answer. The Son of Man might be one of the prophets. Let's see what they say. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. There's our wrong answer. He's one of the prophets, maybe he's Elijah, maybe Jeremiah, come back from the dead. The answer Jesus is hoping for is the answer that we think would be really easy to give. People say you are the Son of Man, because 2,000 years of history putting this together. But the people aren't putting this together yet. This is the conclusion to this question, right? The crowd doesn't know who Jesus is. These convoluted references to the Son of Man, they're not connecting the dots just yet. So who is Jesus Christ, right? It's one of the most important questions ever asked. And what do the people say? They admit he seems to be special. Maybe he's a prophet. Maybe he's a wise man. He seems to be spiritual. But this is as far as they get. And not much has changed in about 2,000 years. Today there's still a super wide-ranging opinion about who Jesus is. In 2020, State of Theology, Ligonier Ministries surveyed American Christian participants in churches, active participants in churches across the country, to react to this statement as a positive or negative. Jesus was a great teacher, but he wasn't God. Over half the people agreed with the statement. 2,000 years later, we're not connecting the dots still. Okay? We're not so different from these people at the time. Whenever someone claims Jesus was a good teacher, a radical zealot, a nice guy, a figment of humanity's collective imagination, the net response is the same. It's rejection of what Jesus has been talking about all through Matthew. And in a world desperate to label Jesus as anything but what he claims to be, there's this hardness that shuts off from true revelation. This is what he's getting at with the crowd. Are people putting together everything I've been talking about yet? And clearly they haven't. Question 2. This is the contrast to this question. 16:15. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? I think reading the conversation in a sort of different way is worth spending time on, right? Jesus is wondering whether anybody out there is taking the biblical uses of Son of Man and comparing them to his words and to his deeds and coming to the right conclusion. So who does anyone say the Son of Man is? Is anybody getting it right? And so Peter answers this. So he asks them, who do you say I am? Simon Peter answers, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus is over the moon about Peter's answer. This guy, Simon, has hit the nail on the head. Right? His faith is hard as a rock. Let's see what all Jesus says to him. Jesus replies after Simon gets this right. He says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I'll give you the kingdom to the keys of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And then he orders his disciples, don't tell anyone that I'm the Messiah. He gives Peter a new name. He's so excited about it, he gives Peter a nickname. And there's some cool Greek Aramaic-ness happening in here. So this guy's name is Simon, son of Jonah, Simon Bar Jonah. Everyone say Simon Bar Jonah. So his name is Simon, son of Jonah. And Jesus says, actually, you're Peter, which the Greek word for that is Petrus. Say Petrus. Ooh. See, this is where we get the word Peter. His name is a little play on the word rock, because Petrus is the Greek word for rock. So he calls Peter Petra, and then he says, and you are a Petra. So you see the little word play that he gets. Most likely, Jesus was speaking Aramaic, and the word for that is Kephas, which is why some of your translations will say he calls him Cephas. That's the other. Anyway, Aramaic. Moving on. But he gives him a little nickname. He says, That's a rock question. That's a rock answer right there. And on that rock, I'm going to build my church. Simon's the Hebrew name, Greek, all this stuff gives him a new name. What Peter's confession of the Lord as Jesus Christ as the Messiah, there's more than just a touch of revolutionary zeal to everything that he says. Right? Let's go back. Where are they? Where are they? Caesarville, Viva la Caesarville. They're standing in the middle of the height of Roman political influence, everything going on there. And Peter says, you are the Messiah, the one that's promised to come and free Israel from occupation. He's standing in the middle of occupation, and he's saying, you're going to get us out of this. This is the confession. So Peter's confession about this, it's got some revolution to it, right? They're standing in the middle of it. Imagine standing in Washington, D.C. You're outside the Capitol building or like the Senate chambers or the White House or whatever, and you've got a big banner and you hold it up and a flag plane with a big banner waves behind it, and the banner says, I'm burning it down. This is what he's saying. This is what Peter is saying. You're the one who's kicking Rome to the curb. And he says it right in the middle of Roman everything. There's King Philip Caesar dedicated to Augustus. Philip is saying, Jesus, you're the Messiah. You're the Christ. It's a shot across the Roman political bow. It's a warning shot. Peter's like, this is it. I knew it. We're doing it. For his part, Jesus knows that there's a lot of political pomp and circumstance to this. The earthly splendor and glory were not the destiny or the goal for Jesus' mission, though. So he's warning his disciples in verse 20. It ends, right? He says, don't tell anyone. You with me? Don't tell anyone what you've just confessed. Because it's not out of fear they're going to be arrested for sedition, right? Jesus is trying to get them not swept up in what is going to seem like a political campaign that he's not the candidate for. Are you with me? Peter's saying, you're the dude who's going to do the thing. And Jesus is like, why don't you keep it to yourself till we figure this out together a little bit. Matthew 16:18. I want to go back to this and hear it because we're going to break this whole thing down. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I may be wrong about this, but I think whenever we hear this verse, whenever I hear people talk about it, we always get this like, this is a very defensive verse. Are you with me? You're a rock and nothing's overcoming it. Are you with me? This is very, we're going to stand our ground here. We're going to be secure against the assaults and the attacks of evil forces and minions that are trying to overthrow things. But have you heard it that way? Good. That's not how the metaphor works, though, right? Let's hear it again. On this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. If the rock of faith keeps us from being assaulted, this verse gives us a picture, if we read it this way, of a bunch of gates. Now close your eyes and picture this. Big gates that have wings, that are flapping around trying to attack this rock position. Are you with me? This is this picture we get. We're in a defensive position and these flying gates are attacking us. But no, right? That doesn't make any sense. This statement is about the church in mission. He says, we have faith like a rock. The church is going to be built on this confession. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Messiah. And you're going to be storming the gates. You're going to be seeking to bring out those that are held behind them, that have been tormented and locked away from what this faith is. We're supposed to be like soldiers with battering rams, trying to rescue those oppressed by sin and its servants. Right? You're supposed to be smashing the gates and knocking them down. This is the image that Jesus is giving here. And Jesus says that those gates are nowhere strong enough to stop it. This is what he's saying. This is establishing the mission of the church. Those are not going to stop. We're breaking those gates down. We're going to rescue the people from it. Peter mishears this message, though. Let's go back. Where are we standing? Caesarville. And Peter hears Jesus, or Peter says, you're the Messiah. And in Peter's mind, Jesus is going to do what? He's going to storm into Rome, and we're going to bash the gates down, and we're going to rescue the people from Israel. We're on a path now. Did you hear this? Is Peter's hearing this? He hears the church is going to go bash down the gates of Rome. This is what we're going to do. The church is going to go bash down the gates of... Jesus' mission was not one of political gain, of retribution, or even like we've talked about before, freedom from earthly enemies. His mission is against the enemy. Okay, let's go all the way back in Matthew. We did a sermon talking about how John was confused. Are you not the Messiah? Because I thought you would do this, but I'm not seeing it. I'm in jail. Do you remember this story? When we think about Jesus coming to solve all of our problems, but following Jesus, we expect He's going to make our wildest dreams come true, but we don't know that our wildest dreams aren't coming true until we see ourselves in the nightmares. Remember this sermon from forever ago. You find yourself where you're scandalized by Jesus because you think Jesus is going to fix everything going on in the world, and it's all great. I'm glad that you're going to do whatever, but I'm sitting here having blank happen to me, and it seems like you're puttering around in heaven. What about me? Solve my problems. Let's fast forward in the story a little bit. Jesus is going to meet a violent oppression. This is next week's sermon into Easter and the entirety of Holy Week. Don't make mistakes that violent oppression somehow means things have gone wrong. Jesus is saying, the kingdom is here. It's just not going to look like you expect, Peter. So what's going to happen in this story? Jesus continues to face growing opposition until he's arrested, he's put up on charges, he gets killed on a crucifixion rack, and he suffers and he dies. And people will clearly see that as the sign of failure, right? Clearly, this is the sign that a dead Messiah is the failed one because you didn't get rid of Rome, and now we're being hunted. People will see that as a failure. Jesus sees it as how things have to go. Peter thinks the kingdom is going to come, and we're going to smash down the gates of Rome. We're kicking those people out, the bad guys, and the Romans are going to be gone. And when we get rid of them, then the real, then everything else can happen. It's all going to be rosy. But Jesus it's not the story, right? Jesus has a different enemy that he has a target on. And it's this old, mysterious enemy, this evil, the spiritual evil that has hijacked human history and taken us completely. Jesus isn't here to solve all of these everyday problems. He's here to be the embodiment of God's love, to bring out the real depth of the enemy, to bring us back into what we were made to be. And he'll conquer that by letting evil conquer him. It's a failure to everybody else, but it's not a failure according to him. And so Jesus' resurrection opens up this new possibility for hope, that God's love and commitment gets the final word. And this sets up the other half of this passage. You can't ignore what happens right after this confession that Peter makes. Let's read it together. You'll see how this all ties together. Matthew 16:21. From that time, right after Peter has this great confession, Jesus starts to explain to his disciples that he's going to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter takes him aside and begins to rebuke him. Basically, hey, you're wrong, right? Because you're here to solve my problems. Right? Rome's a problem, and you just said that you're the Messiah, and he's going to go get rid of Rome, but now you're saying, I'm going to go and you're going to die. And that seems, I don't know if maybe you misheard when I said you were the Messiah. You must have, maybe you didn't clean that. You with me? Great. Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. Never, Lord, he said. This will never happen to you. Jesus turns to Peter and he says, get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You don't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Peter takes it upon himself to teach Jesus a little theology. If you're going to take over the world, then all this talk of death and sacrifice, it's not really a surefire ticket to anything up top. Seems like a failed political campaign. You're not going to get elected to the office of Messiah by saying, I'm a dead man walking, or this year, vote for me, I'll be dead, right? It's not going to work. So maybe you got it a little bit wrong. We're tempted to deal harshly with Peter for his lack of understanding that comes on the heels of confession, right? But honestly, for Peter, he wasn't connecting the dots still. He had confessed who Jesus was, but he didn't fully understand it yet. And the church today isn't really any better. Right? We want to utilize Jesus as a pawn in our power positions. The church wants to receive all the privileges and perks that are accorded that are accorded to us, but maybe not, to have all these other great things. Maybe we can legislate and song-arm people into behaving better. Right? To a lot of Christian people, to a lot of Americans that are wrapped up in the Christian church, America feels more like a Caesarea Philippi than I think we're willing to admit. And what this incident with Peter makes clear is that whatever power the church has, it stems from a single thing alone. And it's if we can properly answer the question, who do you say I am? And it's by knowing who he really is. Because if Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, as Peter said, then no matter how modest the church looks at any given time or place, no matter how imperfect the church is, whatever we have at the very core of all the power, it outstrips anything that has power in the entire world. Any political power, any swinging strong arm, anything else. We have a protecting force, but also a gracious one that forgives, that no one will be able to stop if we combat the real enemy that Jesus came after. Sometimes we need to hear Jesus say, in our own Caesarvilles, that the most important thing for the sake of the gospel is that we do our absolute Spirit-led best to keep in mind the things of God and not the business-as-usual politics in Caesarville. It's not just enough to say, hey, who do you say I am? But do you really know who I am? Let's pray.